Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, actually. Welcome to our latest ARC Talks webinar. I'm really delighted to have Kristen Hsu, who's our Executive Director of Research at ARC, join us today, and she will be taking us through clinical trials for AL amyloidosis. She presented another webinar earlier this year, which focused on ATTR amyloidosis, so that won't be covered today. If you're interested, that webinar is available on our website at arci.org. So just a brief introduction, the next slide. These webinars are brought to you by ARC. ARC is a nonprofit foundation that focuses on accelerating the development of new treatments and improving outcomes for and care of patients with amyloidosis. We have 4 areas that we focus on. The next slide, Kristen. And these include improving the speed and accuracy of diagnosis. As anyone who has been diagnosed or experienced amyloidosis, you'll know how important it is that patients are accurately diagnosed early and the impact that that can have. The 2 areas in the middle are around increasing the scientific understanding of the disease, and then also accelerating the development of new and effective treatments for patients. And the last area that we focus on is enhancing care and quality of life of patients throughout their journey with amyloidosis. And ARC Talks falls nicely into that program. I'd like to take a moment to thank all the sponsors of ARC Talks, and this includes individual donors like you who make it possible for us to put on the broad range of programs that we do. So now I'm delighted to hand over to Kristen. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Hsu, and I'm the Executive Director of Clinical Research here at ARC. My background is actually in drug development. So before joining ARC, my career had been focused on planning and executing clinical trials across a number of different disease spaces. I worked in Alzheimer's disease for a number of years before moving into the rare and ultra-rare disease space. Now, I love that working in rare disease gives you the opportunity to learn directly from patients in order to design your research. You need to understand what they're going through, what their disease is, how they experience it, and how it might be different than any other patient with the same disease, how they're impacted by it, and ultimately how we can learn from their perspectives to use them to better design clinical trials and develop effective treatments for patients. That's what drew me to ARC and what drives our research initiatives today. I'm excited to talk through some of the updates on clinical trials that are taking place in the AL amyloidosis community right now. We will plan to post this webinar on our website, so you'll be able to go back and refer to it as you need moving forward. As Isabel mentioned, we're not going to cover TTR amyloidosis as part of this. So if you do have TTR amyloidosis and are joining in, we have the webinar that I did back in June posted both on our website, and you can also find it on our YouTube page as well. You're welcome to stay and join. We'll talk a little bit about clinical trials more broadly, but the actual studies that we discuss will be AL amyloidosis exclusively. Now, before we dive directly into trials, I want to take a few minutes to just discuss what clinical trials are and some of the fundamental pieces of information that patients should take into account when considering whether this is something they want to participate in. Clinical trials, sometimes called clinical studies, are a type of research that evaluate whether a medical strategy, a drug, a treatment, or a device is safe and effective for patients. Studies can look at other aspects of care, like improving quality of life for patients, imaging, or even just asking how to generate data to help us better understand how a disease progresses over time. There are 2 main types of trials, generally interventional trials, which involve the administration of some type of intervention, whether it be a drug or a strategy. It's given, and researchers then study the outcomes in patients. Or observational trials, where patients are observed over a period of time and their outcomes are measured. Now, clinical trials are typically classified into 4 main stages called phases. Phase 1 studies are typically very small studies. They determine a safe dose of a treatment and monitor how the treatment affects the body. Phase 2 generally involves more patients. A slightly larger number of patients determines if a new treatment is seemingly effective, so whether it's actually doing what it's intended to do and monitoring any safety or side effects. Phase 3 studies will confirm how well a treatment works, monitor for side effects, and compare how the new treatment might work with current standard of care or with a control arm in a randomized controlled study. So either with standard of care or against a placebo. And then lastly, phase 4 studies are studies that are typically done after a drug has received regulatory approval. They're much larger studies typically and are used to gather more information on a drug or a treatment to see if its effects in different populations with any side effects associated with long-term use. We're going to review one of each of these studies or studies in each of these phases as part of this presentation. Now, it's important to note that there is no single or linear roadmap to developing new drugs. It's just as some drugs will need multiple studies within a given phase, it's also possible to combine some phases within a single trial or skip a phase entirely. This is especially true in rare disease where there are very few patients and studies are very difficult to challenging to design. So something to keep in mind. Now, what's involved in trials? Most clinical trials are investigational and interventional, sorry. All of the trials that I reviewed today are going to be interventional trials and thus require administration of a study drug or treatment and a series of visits to specialized and trained study centers or sites to test and to monitor the effects of the drug. Some studies do allow for some tests and visits to be carried out at home health visits where trained nurses can carry these out, but the majority will be at a study site. Now, depending on the size of a study, there may be only 1 to 2 study sites across the United States, across the world, or there could be many. You might, in order to participate in a clinical trial, you might need to travel to a center that is different than the one you receive your regular care at in order to participate in a trial. You'll need to consider how easy or difficult it might be for you to travel to this study site and to do so repeatedly during the course of the study, which in some cases could be years. Now, this is a normal and very common occurrence and something that doctors and care teams work closely to coordinate. As an example, I'm located outside of Boston myself, but it's very typical for patients all over the Northeast and even the Mid-Atlantic to travel to Boston to participate in clinical trials, to complete their specific study visits and tests at centers like BU or Tufts or Brigham, but then continue to see their regular doctor and care team near their homes as they normally would. The doctors in Boston connect with the regular care teams and make sure that both groups are communicating and coordinating care for those patients. Now, if you don't live near a clinical trial center and do need to travel in order to participate, many study sponsors are able to support travel costs associated with the study visits. But this is something you'll need to ask about specifically when you're considering a trial. Most visits can be conducted in a single day, but there are some that might require overnight stays. And so it's important to ask about this up front and make sure you understand the commitment. Trials for AL amyloidosis commonly require clinical examinations, and these might include checking your vital signs, reviewing your medications, any side effects you might be receiving or experiencing, having blood and urine tests, completing questionnaires called patient-reported outcome measures, or questionnaires that might ask you about the symptoms that you're experiencing, how they might be impacting your quality of life. Functional tests, a common one is the 6-minute walk test, which is a test that measures how well your heart is functioning. You've got 2 traffic cones that are set up 30 meters apart, and you'll be asked to walk around it for 6 minutes to measure how far you're actually able to walk in that time frame. And then imaging tests like ECGs, echoes, and cardiac MRIs, nuclear PET scans if you have heart involvement or are trying to determine if you have heart involvement. Now, not every test will be performed at every visit, but most will be done at least once during what's called a screening phase for a study to see if you qualify to participate, and then will be conducted regularly throughout the duration of the trial, some tests more frequently than others. Typically tests like checking your vital signs, con meds, or checking your medication side effects. Those are things going to happen at every single visit, whereas some of the bigger tests like imaging or functional tests, those might only be done every few months. Now, whether or not to participate in a clinical trial is a very personal decision and one to consider carefully with your doctor and with your trusted loved ones. There are a number of different benefits to participating in clinical trials, including the opportunity to be treated with an investigational drug that might not be available anywhere else. It might be the only way to actually receive that treatment by participating in a trial at a given time. Patients participating in amyloidosis clinical trials receive expert and vigilant care from trained research teams that specialize in amyloidosis. In most cases, patients will be seen and monitored more frequently than they would otherwise, which can be a tremendous benefit and comfort to patients. Visiting these expert amyloidosis centers through clinical trials can offer an amazing opportunity to learn more about your disease and how to manage it, particularly if you aren't able to see experts as part of your regular care. And then lastly, by participating in research, some patients really benefit from the sense that they're helping others by helping scientists better understand their disease, helping them advance treatments, and potentially helping them discover ways to prevent it for other patients in the future. Now, with that said, just like there are potential benefits, there are also potential risks to participating in clinical trials. Trials can involve a large time commitment and can be inconvenient with the time and effort it might take to travel and take part in each visit. There might be risks associated not only with the study drug, but also risks that are known and still unknown if it's a new drug, and then risks that could be associated with the study procedures themselves, the different tests that are involved. If the trial involves an experimental or investigational drug, it might not work. Those who get it as part of the study might not receive any benefit from that drug or any benefit over the regular standard of care. And then depending on the trial, some participants may be randomly assigned to receive a treatment, standard treatment or a placebo, which is a treatment that has no active properties like a sugar pill or a saline solution, and won't know whether they received the active drug or this placebo until the trial is completed. Now, the possible benefits and risks of participating in each specific trial will be explained to participants in a detailed process called the informed consent. This is a document that will outline all of the potential benefits and risks, and it's something that you'll talk about in detail with the study team that's actually the doctor and the study team. Patients should use that time to ask questions and help them make the best decision for themselves about whether this is something that they want to participate in or not. So that's my background on clinical trials. For the rest of the time, I want to review some of the key interventional clinical trials that are going on in AL amyloidosis. I'm not going to review every trial, but I do want to focus on the trials that are recruiting for novel therapies for AL. Now, to understand how to treat AL amyloidosis, let's first review how the disease works. This is going to be very high level, but it's important to have a common understanding so that you understand how the different treatments in different trials might work. Now, it starts in the bone marrow, which is a specialized tissue in the hollow center of our bones where blood cells are produced. One of the blood cell types, white blood cells or plasma cells, produce what are called immunoglobulins, which are also called antibodies, known as antibodies, which target and neutralize bacteria and viruses. We all have these, we all make these, and they're all made of two kinds of protein chains, heavy chains and light chains. Now, in AL amyloidosis, in patients with AL amyloidosis, abnormal plasma cells actually produce an excess of abnormal light chains. These abnormal light chain fragments then aggregate and form what are called amyloid fibrils. Normal light chains are excreted through the kidneys, but with abnormal or misfolded proteins and fibrils, these can't be excreted normally, and so it causes them to build up in the blood. These amyloid fibrils circulate in the bloodstream and then deposit in the various organs. In AL amyloidosis, very commonly the heart, kidneys, less commonly liver, peripheral nerves, causing damage. And so that's how the disease works, but how do we treat it? And so I want to think of the analogy of a bathtub. And so if you liken free light chain production or free light chains as water, and then amyloid depositing in the body as a bathtub filling up with water. You can see that you start with an empty tub, and over time, water fills up that tub, similar to a faucet of free light chains, which then form amyloid fibrils accumulating and depositing throughout the body. Now, to fix the bathtub, or to treat the full bathtub, to empty it, you could either turn down or turn off the faucet, slowing down and stopping the production of light chains. When the rate of free light chain production is slowed or stopped, amyloid buildup declines, it halts, and then organ function theoretically stabilizes. You'd actually have to drain the tub in order to remove all of the existing amyloid. And in an ideal situation, you're both turning off the faucet, so stopping production of new light chains, and draining the tub in order to clear the existing amyloid that's deposited within the body. And so that's the analogy I want you to think about when we think about the different treatments that are used for AL amyloidosis. Now, coming back to this slide, many of the therapies that are currently used or being studied for AL amyloidosis aim to suppress or eliminate the abnormal plasma cells in the bone marrow and the free light chains they produce. So these are called anti-plasma cell therapies. And so they're working to turn off the faucet. They're working to stop production of the free light chains to prevent them from forming fibrils and depositing in the body. There are a number of different ways that drugs can work to attack plasma cells. So if you look at this list here on the left, I'm going to start with monoclonal antibodies. These are molecules that attach themselves to the surface proteins of abnormal plasma cells and either directly kill them, or they allow your immune system to identify and destroy them on their own. Daratumumab, Darzalex right now is the only treatment that is currently approved for AL amyloidosis, and it's a monoclonal antibody. A number of these other products that you see in red, including isatuximab, elotuzumab, belantamab, these are all drugs that are actually initially developed and studied and approved for multiple myeloma, but there's quite a bit to suggest that they would also be similarly effective in AL amyloidosis. And so that's why you see both the commercial names as well as the non-commercial names. The next class of drugs, again, still plasma cell-directed therapies, so aiming to turn off the faucet, are BCL2 inhibitors. These are drugs that might stop the growth of abnormal plasma cells by blocking BCL2, which is a protein that is needed for cancer cell survival or survival of those abnormal plasma cells. The next class of drugs are bispecific antibodies. Now, bispecific antibodies are composed of two different fragments that bind to two different types of cells at the same time. There's one fragment that attaches to plasma cells responsible for the plasma cells that are responsible for making your light chains, which might help or slow down the production of those light chains and then prevent them from forming fibrils. The second piece of the bispecific antibody binds to the immune system's fighter cells called the T cells, which signals them to attack and destroy the plasma cells that make the faulty light chains. So it's trying to attack your plasma cells in two different ways. The last class of anti-plasma cell therapies that we'll talk about are known as CAR-T, or chimeric antigen receptor cellular CAR-T cellular therapy. This is a type of cellular therapy in which a patient's T cells are changed in a laboratory so that they'll attack cancer cells. This is done by first collecting T cells from a patient's blood, modifying them by essentially giving them a GPS tracker that helps them find and attack cancer cells or plasma cells in this case, then grow the number of T cells in large numbers and then reinfuse them back into the patient's bodies. And so we've got one CAR-T therapy that has now entered clinical trials for AL amyloidosis, which we'll talk about in a few slides. So again, these are all anti-plasma cell therapies, different types that work at turning off the faucet. The next class of drugs are called light chain stabilizers. And these are drugs that kind of fit between turning off the faucet as well as emptying the tub. So light chain stabilizers are a new treatment approach in AL amyloidosis designed to prevent the abnormal folding of light chains, helping them to keep their correct shape so that they don't misfold into toxic forms, which then prevents them from clumping together and forming deposits throughout the body. So it still is a way of like turning off the faucet. It's not stopping the production of light chains, but it is stopping them from misfolding and filling up that tub. And then the last class of drugs are called antifibril agents. And so these are the drugs that are actually emptying the bathtub. They're designed to attach to amyloid fibrils that have formed in the organs, so like your heart, your kidneys, and then either break the fibrils apart directly or mark their form removal by the immune system. And so we've got our anti-plasma cell therapies, light chain stabilizers, and antifibril agents. Now, this slide is one that we'll come back to a couple times moving forward. You can see the way it's set up is I've got the different classes of drugs on the far left. So these top three drugs, the monoclonal antibodies, the bispecifics, the cellular therapies, and the BCL2 inhibitors, these are all your anti-plasma cell-directed therapies. You've got your light chain stabilizer, and then you've got your antifibril agents at the bottom. got the drugs actually named in the third column on the left, and then the status of where these different drugs are in clinical development over on the far right. We're going to start by looking at the industry-sponsored trials currently recruiting for patients, specifically the 5 trials that are outlined here in red. I'm going to go from bottom to top. So the AQUARIUS study is a phase 2 study evaluating Daratumumab, which again, it's a monoclonal antibody. It's approved for the treatment of AL amyloidosis, and it works by targeting plasma cells by binding to a specific protein found on the surface of abnormal plasma cells. Once Daratumumab attaches to the plasma cells, it triggers the immune system to attack and kill the plasma cells. Daratumumab is approved for the treatment of AL amyloidosis here in the United States and a number of countries globally, but this is a study that is evaluating its use in 2 specific groups or cohorts of newly diagnosed AL amyloidosis patients. Now, the cohort recruiting patients, so there was a cohort that was recruiting for patients who had advanced cardiac involvement. That one's actually closed for recruitment. So I'm just going to focus on the cohort of patients that is still recruiting for patients with at least one organ impacted by amyloidosis, but who have received no prior current lines of treatment and who are self-identified racial or ethnic minorities. So this includes patients who are of Asian descent, Hispanic or Latino American, Black, African American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, or American Indian descent. Now, the goal of this portion of the study is to understand how the bodies of patients of these different racial and ethnic backgrounds interact with injections of Daratumumab when treated in combination with Antibody or VCD. So this is a common treatment regimen that includes cyclophosphamide, otherwise known as Velcade, cyclophosphamide, bortezomib, otherwise known as Velcade, or dexamethasone, by looking at the concentration of Daratumumab right before the patient's next dose. This is an open label study, meaning that everybody who participates in this study will receive Daratumumab, and it will be administered in cycles weekly at first, and will then move to every 2 weeks and 4 weeks along with Cyborg or VCD. Again, it's the same thing, just different names of bortezomib or Velcade. Now, patients who participate in the study will participate in it for about 1 to 2 years. And then we'll go on to the next slide. The study is currently recruiting for 7 additional patients across different centers in the US or UK. And I've noted the centers that are currently recruiting here in the US. You can see them about 14 different centers, and you'll be able to find the information for where these centers are through my Amyloidosis Pathfinder, which I'll discuss a little bit later. The next study I want to highlight is the Linker-AL2 study. This is a phase 2 study of Linvoseltamab, which is a bispecific antibody in patients with relapsed refractory AL amyloidosis. Relapsed refractory amyloidosis, these are patients who have AL amyloidosis that have been treated, and the AL amyloidosis has either returned or has failed other therapies and needs to be treated again. Now, if you remember, bispecific antibodies are drugs that have the 2 different fragments that bind to 2 different places on plasma cells, or 2 different places trying to attack plasma cells at the same time. So in the case of Linvoseltamab, it attaches to what's called a BCMA antigen on plasma cells, which makes the light change. And so that is hoped will help stop and slow down the production of free light chains. And then the second place it attaches to is on the CD3 antigen of T cells, which are part of your immune system, signaling them to attack and destroy the plasma cells. Now, this is a phase 2, this is a 2-part study of Linvoseltamab. In the first phase, Linvoseltamab is going to be studied in a small number of participants to understand the side effects of the study drug and to determine a dose that can be used in the second phase of the study, which is the phase 2 portion. In the phase 2 portion of the study, Linvoseltamab is going to be given to more study participants and continue to assess the side effects of the study drug and also evaluate the ability of Linvoseltamab to actually treat AL amyloidosis. The study is anticipated to last about 3 years. It's currently enrolling in 4 centers globally, including 3 centers in Spain and then 1 center in US. And the US center is City of Hope in Duarte, California. Now, the next study is a phase 1 study evaluating the safety and activity of ABBV-383 in patients with relapsed refractory amyloidosis. So again, those who have AL amyloidosis that has been treated, but it's returned, or it failed other therapies and they need to be treated again. ABBV-383 is another BCMA CD3 specific antibody similar to Linvoseltamab. So again, attaching to BCMA on the plasma cells and then the CD3 antigen on T cells. So working to destroy those plasma cells in 2 different ways. The study is going to measure the highest safe and recommended dose of ABBV-383 as a monotherapy or a single treatment in patients, as well as some preliminary assessment of how it impacts patients, so how it actually works to treat the disease. The study is broken into 2 parts, a dose escalation and a safety expansion with 5 different arms. During the dose escalation phase of the study, patients will receive one of 3 different doses of the study drug, ABBV-383, which will then be used to determine the doses that are given in part 2. In this part 2 portion, the dose expansion portion of the study, a larger group of patients will begin and receive one of the 2 different doses that are determined in that earlier stage. Now, in order to qualify for this study, patients need to have had at least 1 prior therapy that includes a proteasome inhibitor and at least 1 anti-CD38 antibody, like Daratumumab as an example, and have at least 1 organ that is involved. All patients will receive ABBV-383 as part of the study, and it'll be administered as an infusion every 4 weeks for up to 2 years. The study is going to enroll 76 patients across the world and is currently open at 13 different sites across the US, Japan, Australia, France, and Greece. You can see here, I've highlighted the location of the 4 different centers that are currently recruiting in the United States. So in Boston, 2 centers in New York, and then Charlotte, North Carolina. Moving on to the next study, NexaCAR-2 is a phase 1b study of a study drug known as NXC-201, which is the first CAR T therapy that's being studied in AL amyloidosis in patients with relapsed refractory amyloidosis. So again, have been treated previously, but the amyloidosis has returned or they've failed prior treatments. And just as a quick reminder, CAR T is a type of cellular therapy in where a patient's T cells are genetically modified. So T cells are collected from a patient. They're given essentially a GPS tracker that helps them find and attack the plasma cells. Large numbers of these T cells are then grown and then put back into the patient's body. This is a study that will recruit for 40 patients that have been previously treated for AL amyloidosis with the goal of evaluating safety of NXC-201 in patients with AL. And will be also the goal of the study is to determine the actual dose to be used in a subsequent phase 2 study. All patients will receive NXC-201 as part of this, which is going to be administered as a single one-time infusion following the process of leukapheresis and leukodepletion. Leukapheresis is a process where the white blood cells are collected from patients. They're connected to a machine that then actually collects the blood cells and separates the white blood cells from the rest of the blood. The cells are then shipped to the laboratory. They're modified. They're given that GPS tracker. They're grown and then reinfused back into patients. Lymphodepletion, which is also called lymph depleting or preconditioning, then involves receiving a short course of chemotherapy to kill all of the current T cells before the modified T cells are then put back into study participants. And so this is a one-time infusion when you receive NXC-201, but it is a bit more of an intensive process getting to that point. This is a study that will last about 2 years initially with further long-term follow-up planned. It's currently recruiting at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, but it was just announced that additional centers will be opening at Cleveland Clinic, UC Davis, and Sutter Health in California. And the last study I'm going to talk about is the AFFIRM-AL study. This is a large phase 3 study evaluating Birtamimab in patients with newly diagnosed AL amyloidosis Mayo stage 4. Newly diagnosed AL amyloidosis are patients who are recently diagnosed and have not yet been previously treated for AL amyloidosis. And then Mayo stage 4 Mayo stages are a prognostic staging system that are assigned to patients at the time of diagnosis, that typically are used to assess the heart involvement, how much a heart might be involved in a patient's AL amyloidosis, and determine how aggressive the AL amyloidosis might be. And so this is looking at Birtamimab in a very specific stage of patients right after they've been diagnosed. Birtamimab is an antifibril antibody. So this is going to be the first drug that we're talking about that's actually working to drain the tub. It's not turning off the faucet, but it's draining the tub. It's designed to target and clear the existing amyloid in patients who have AL amyloidosis. The goal of this study is to measure the efficacy, so how well the drug works and does what it's intended to do, whether it keeps patients living longer, and the safety of Birtamimab plus chemotherapy in adult patients with AL amyloidosis. So specifically looking at whether treatment with Birtamimab reduces the risk of death. The study is recruiting 220 patients who are treatment naive, so have not received any prior treatment for their AL amyloidosis, across a number of different centers in the US and globally. We'll look at centers in the next couple slides. It's administered as an IV, so intravenous infusion directly into the vein, along with chemotherapy once every 4 weeks. This is a placebo-controlled study. And so in this study, patients have a 2/3 chance of being assigned to Birtamimab with chemotherapy, or a 1 in 3 chance of being assigned to placebo plus chemotherapy. So all patients will receive chemotherapy as part of it, but there's a 2 out of 3 chance that they get also assigned to Birtamimab versus a 1 out of 3 chance that they get assigned to the placebo, which is again a substance that has no active drug properties, like a sugar treatment. It's a double-blind study, which means that neither patients nor their study doctors will know which patients receive Birtamimab. It's also an event-driven study, meaning that the study will complete after a certain number of deaths have occurred in the whole population of study participants. So each patient's participation will be different, but it's anticipated to last about 2 to 3 years in total. The study is going to enroll 220 patients across the world, and it's currently open in 22 different countries. I won't name all of these. You can see them on the slide, largely North America, Europe, as well as Asia Pacific. And then we've got 27 centers that are recruiting currently in the US, which I've noted here. And again, you'll be able to see which centers and how to contact them through a tool called My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, which I'll mention in the next few slides. Now, those are the novel therapies that are currently recruiting, have trials that are currently recruiting for AL amyloidosis. I do want to highlight some future development for novel therapies in AL amyloidosis, specifically the light chain stabilizers that I was referring to earlier. So again, a light chain stabilizer is a new treatment approach in AL amyloidosis that is designed to prevent the abnormal folding of light chains, helping them to keep their correct shape so that they don't go on to misfold into toxic forms, clumping together, forming fibrils, clumping together, and forming deposits on the organs. And so there is a drug that is in early stage development, so it hasn't been tested in humans yet, but this is a treatment approach that we're excited to see advance, as it's been shown to be effective in TTR amyloidosis, another type of amyloidosis. And so we're excited to see this move forward in AL amyloidosis and see whether this might be a viable treatment approach in that population. Now, there are a lot of trials that are ongoing at a given time. I only covered a fraction of them. Some of the ones, and so I do want to quickly mention that, like, some of the trials that we didn't cover today. There are a number of trials that are ongoing with a product called venetoclax, which is a BCL2 BCL2 inhibitor. So just as a reminder, a BCL2 inhibitor, it's a drug that is designed to stop the growth of cancer cells or plasma cells by blocking BCL2, which is a protein that's needed for cancer cell survival. Venetoclax is approved for the treatment of multiple myeloma, and there are a number of reasons to suggest and data to support that it might be a good option for a portion of patients who have AL amyloidosis. The trials that are currently recruiting for patients with venetoclax are recruiting for patients who have a specific abnormal genetic change called translocation factor 1114. So you can see that written on the slide as T and then in parentheses 1114. T1114 translocation factor is relevant for venetoclax treatment because it's a factor that results in the overexpression of BCL2. So patients with T1114 produce more BCL2, and since venetoclax targets cancer cells by targeting BCL2, these patients might be most likely to benefit from treatment of venetoclax. So that's why you see it mentioned in these 3 trials. There are also a number of investigator initiative-led trials looking at different treatment regimens that involve Daratumumab. Again, Daratumumab is approved for the treatment of AL amyloidosis, but there are a number of different treatment regimens for different groups of patients that are being studied by physicians who are knowledgeable experts in the myeloma and also applying those learnings in AL amyloidosis. There are also some trials with other monoclonal antibodies that we haven't already discussed today, including Belantamab and Elrantamab. I've noted these here. These trials are these slides will be available to you after, so you can kind of look these up. These are typically studies that are done in fewer centers. Sometimes it's only in one center, in small numbers of patients. Some of these trials, like the SWOG trial, which is the monoclonal phase 3 study comparing Dara-VCD chemotherapy plus stem cell transplant to just Dara-VCD chemotherapy alone. This is a trial that's being done by SWOG. So this is a big trial, 338 patients, 35 centers across the US. So again, these are all trials that are currently recruiting. We just won't have the time to go through each and every one of them, but they could be very good treatment options for individual patients. There are also some imaging trials that are currently being recruited. One that I'll call out specifically, the CardiAg study. This is an imaging trial looking to validate whether a PET radiotracer called florbetaben can be used to diagnose cardiac AL amyloidosis. So in that case, it's recruiting for patients who have suspected AL amyloidosis, but it's also going to investigate whether florbetaben PET scans can show the amount of amyloid that's deposited in the hearts of patients who have already been diagnosed with AL. So it can actually be used to determine the stage of the disease in patients who have a diagnosis of AL. So it's looking for both groups, those who have a suspected diagnosis and then those who have a confirmed diagnosis. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are interventional trials, there are observational trials. And so there are a number of different observational trials that are currently recruiting. Now, how do you stay informed and find clinical trials if you are interested in participating? There are a few different ways to do so. Clinicaltrials.gov is a publicly available and federally mandated national database of clinical trials. So every clinical trial, if it's starting up in the US, has to be put on clinicaltrials.gov. And that's something that anybody can go on, search, and find. I will say, as somebody who regularly goes into clinicaltrials.gov, it's not always the easiest tool to use. And so if you do a quick search for like amyloidosis, you'll come up with hundreds of clinical trials, but those aren't all necessarily trials that are actually being done in amyloidosis. Some of what comes up in those search results are trials that exclude patients with amyloidosis. It's trials that are looking for other types of amyloid, like brain amyloid, Alzheimer's studies. And so you just have to be very careful when you use it to make sure that you're using the right search criteria. That said, a great way to stay informed of trials is to talk to your healthcare provider. So ask your healthcare provider about trials, if they're participating in trials, and if there are trials that they know of that you might be eligible for. They'll be able to help connect you with centers that are participating and really advocate on your behalf. You can stay connected with groups like ARC or the amyloidosis support groups, ASG, other country-specific support groups for those who are joining us globally. It's a great way to stay informed of clinical trials that are recruiting and the results of trials that are ongoing. And then lastly, I mentioned this a few times, but ARC developed an online tool called My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, or MAP for short, to help patients with amyloidosis get connected to treatment centers and clinical trials specific to their type of amyloidosis and symptoms. You can access MAP by going to myamyloidosispathfinder.org. I'll drop the link in the chat and we can send it as a follow-up when we send out the slides. Patients and caregivers who sign up for MAP will be asked to answer a few short questions about their disease, what type of amyloidosis they have, what organ involvement they have, if they've ever been treated for it before. And then once their profile is completed, they're able to find and compare different treatment centers that suit their individual needs and also get matched to clinical trials that they might qualify for based off of the answers in their profile. And so it's really important if you are using MAP to make sure that you're answering it to the best of your ability, and also that that you're updating it over time. If you're getting more organs involved, if you're starting treatments, it's going to filter results for you based off of really what you have entered in at a given time. It's a great way to stay informed of and get involved with clinical trials, which ultimately helps advance research towards better treatments and a cure for amyloidosis. So that is my last slide. I thank everybody for the opportunity to speak, and hopefully this was helpful. I know it's a lot to go through.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And we have an opportunity to have a little time with, if anyone has questions they'd like to have answered by Kristen. We have a few questions, and I would give, first of all, it is so complicated, and AL amyloidosis in particular, looking at the different approaches to treatment. And so the complexity of the different types of treatments and studies, I know, can feel absolutely overwhelming. And certainly as a patient myself, I felt that when I was first diagnosed, and still many years on, struggle to see some of the nuances of different trials. So speaking to an amyloid expert, you're always welcome to call ARC. We have a support line, and we are happy to help talk through and clarify what those might be. I would also just give an additional plug to use myamyloidosispathfinder.org. It was something that we really saw there was a need for. Really hard to find out, even often from the experts who are treating you. They're not aware of all the clinical trials that are going on, and that was really why we developed it, realizing that there was this gap. Hearing about clinical trials and when they open is something that's really, I think, important and empowering as a patient. So getting that information emailed to you for trials that you match. It's also in the background with a data which is anonymized, so we don't relate it to anybody, but it really helps us understand where there is an unmet need, what patients are waiting and looking for trials, which can then help us inform companies as they're developing trials, that where sites maybe could be opened, or if there are different subgroups of patients that would really benefit from having a trial of a particular treatment. So it helps us as an organization advocate for better and more accessible trials. So please consider signing up for it if you haven't. So I'm going to jump in to the questions, Kristen. There is one which I feel close to my heart, so I'm going to jump in first, is how do you find clinical trials in the UK? And what I would just suggest, I'll answer this one, is that actually the National Amyloidosis Centre definitely partakes in a large number of the trials. And so speaking to them is a good choice. The other thing I would do is suggest that you connect with Myeloma UK. Although it's an organization that focuses on multiple myeloma, they do support patients with AL amyloidosis, and they're very aware of the and work and support clinical trials that are going on across the UK, and so it would be a good port of call. Now we'll come back to the States. So we have a question which is, why would the antifibril agents for AL not work on all forms of amyloidosis in the heart and other organs?
So each of the antifibril agents are designed to target a specific part of a fibril, which will be different for different types of amyloidosis. So I'm not sure if this is referring to like TTR versus AL, but typically they are designed to tackle a specific amyloid fibril that's either derived from TTR or AL or ALAP2. With that said, there is a molecule being developed, or a suite of molecules being developed by a company called Atralis, which are called pan-amyloid removal therapies. And so they're actually designed to tackle all forms of amyloid fibrils. And so it depends very much on the molecule, but they are typically designed to remove amyloidosis regardless of what type of organ is involved. It just depends on whether it's going to be a TTR or AL, unless it's this pan-amyloid removal technology that Atralis is working on.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a question which I think is a good one to kind of have at the top of the questions is, how is relapse defined? I know this is a challenging question actually, but that's helpful. And I know we hear different terminology and it can be really confusing as a patient.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and not one that we have a really good answer for. One of the challenges facing the community right now is how to define what progression looks like after a patient has received a response. So if a patient's been treated for AL amyloidosis, they go into response, their light chain levels go back to normal. But then if over time you start seeing the difference in the free light chain start creeping up, at what point do you consider that patient as having like relapsed amyloidosis and needing to be treated again? In many cases, those light chains start creeping up, but you don't see any organ involvement, and there's no common guidelines or standardization across the community about like when should a patient be treated again. Treatments with AL amyloidosis are not without their side effects. They're aggressive treatments. And so physicians need to be, and rightfully so, are really cautious in terms of when it's right to treat patients. And so I wish I had a good answer for how we should do this. One of the things we're working to do as an organization is actually a study of healthcare professionals to understand their perspectives on how and when to treat patients who do advance and progress with AL amyloidosis, what they would consider relapsed AL amyloidosis to be, when they would initiate treatment, what treatments they would even use. And so it's definitely something the community is struggling with, and I think it's something that everybody is really prioritizing moving forward.
Thank you. Can you comment on the phase 3 trial of KALE-101?
Yeah, so I didn't cover that today, but KALE-101, also known as Anti-Amyloid, if I'm pronouncing it correctly by memory. So it's another antifibril agent similar to Birtamimab. So it's going to be one that drains the tub. So it's going to be one that attacks the existing amyloid deposits within the body and removes it. They have 2 phase 3 studies that are currently ongoing. They've completed enrollment. They're no longer recruiting patients, which is why I didn't cover it today. But those studies are ongoing, 2 large phase 3 studies, and based off of clinicaltrials.gov are expected to read out within the next few months. It's 2 different studies, so it's got 2 different end dates. Each one will end at a different time, but that's obviously going to be really impactful news for the community when those results are available. So they're placebo-controlled, double-blind studies, so we don't know the results, but it's something that we're definitely looking forward to, and we'll share with the community as the data becomes available.
Thank you. And that's also, if you sign up for our newsletter, you will always get that. We'll send you hot off the press of any of these results that once they come out. And there's a question, and I think it relates to the Daratumumab study. What is the amyloidosis correlation with minority ethnic groups? You talked about that, the second part of the study that was still enrolling.
Yeah, so that study is recruiting for patients with different racial and ethnic backgrounds as part of a post-marketing commitment. So the initial study that got Daratumumab approved included a very small percentage of patients who were of racial and ethnic differences, minority backgrounds. And so it was very small numbers, but it looked like Daratumumab might have been absorbed differently and interacted differently in the bodies of those patients. But with that said, it was such a small number that it's impossible to really be able to make that determination. And so that studying is being done to actually study it in a broader number of patients to really understand if it doesn't like interact differently and how that might be the case. And so that's really what that study is for.
And on the venetoclax trial, you mentioned the T1114. Can you just talk a bit more about what that is? There's a question asking, is there a percent that you need to have per fish? So that's...
Yeah. There were 3 different venetoclax trials. There are a number of different venetoclax trials, so I'd have to go back to see like if there are different thresholds for each one. But translocation factor is this genetic change that a percentage of patients with AL amyloidosis have that causes your body to overproduce BCL2. And venetoclax works by actually targeting BCL2. So that's why many of the trials for venetoclax are looking specifically for patients who have that T1114 factor. I'm afraid I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, and it might be different for each trial, but that's something I'm happy to follow up with that patient and confirm.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any clinical trials that you're aware of targeting GI involvement?
I don't know off the top of my head if there are any AL studies that have GI endpoints or are looking specifically for patients who have GI involvement. Many of the studies that are enrolling are designed around endpoints that are easily measurable. And so typically that ends up being cardiac endpoints or kidney endpoints or looking at survival, because those are things that are easy to measure over time. We don't have really good endpoints to look at GI involvement and how a drug might be, how patients might or might not be responding to treatments from a GI perspective. So I don't know any off the top of my head, but it's certainly something I can look through. But it is typically the trials are really designed around like cardiac involvement or kidney involvement. Now, that's not to say that the treatments won't also work for GI involvement. It just means that they're designed around studying the effects in heart and kidney, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I think this is one of the complexities with AL amyloidosis is the symptoms we experience are from the organ involvement, and every patient has a different pattern of organ involvement. And so clinical trials try and get the most similar patients to compare one to another, particularly those on treatment and those not. And so often some of the symptoms, while it might focus on the most common symptoms, aren't focused on that actually can have the biggest impact on patients. And so that's something that we've been working on very closely with FDA, and to make sure that we really can capture as much of the disease impact for patients as we develop these new studies and look at them. There's been a couple of questions around imaging, and one is, are any imaging studies up on MAP? And also, could you comment on PYP scan, and is that something that's been studied in AL? And
yeah, so we have a number of imaging studies up on MAP. I believe the cardiac one, it should be on MAP. If not, it's going to be within the next few days. It's a relatively newer study. PYP is a molecular SPECT technology. It's actually like a bone tracer that is used commonly to diagnose TTR amyloidosis. And so most of the studies that are using PYP or looking at PYP are looking at its ability to screen patients and diagnose patients with TTR amyloidosis. There are some that might be looking at PYP's ability to detect treatment changes, response to treatment, and change over time, but typically it's in a screening diagnostic phase. I don't know of any trials that are looking at PYP specifically in AL amyloidosis, as it's typically more specific to TTR. It's not out of the question that it can actually detect AL, but it's more commonly used to detect TTR amyloidosis.
And thank you. There was a question, and I think this was around, are there any, I have to now find it. any studies for caregivers and family members going on in progress? And I thought this might be a chance, actually. I know that today you focused on interventional, so drugs that are actually addressing the amyloidosis, but I thought you might want to touch on some of the particularly community research and other opportunities.
Yeah. So there are definitely some studies that are looking at understanding caregiver burden. It's a really important and relevant topic for many different types of disease, but especially in amyloidosis of different types. And so one of the ways we actually look at understanding the impact of the disease on caregivers is through our annual community survey. And so this is a survey study that we launch yearly. It will be launching actually probably within the next month, in early October timeframe. And it's something that is available to both caregivers and patients. And so they'll get two different surveys depending on who they are, but we're looking to understand experience with diagnosis, getting access to treatment and care, but then also understanding really kind of what your perspectives are, how the disease is impacting you, whether you're a patient or a caregiver. And so this is something that we're starting to see in more and more studies focusing on understanding the impact of the disease on immediate caregivers and on the broader family overall.
And I know there's a question here, which sounds like it's about the Protego study. Is the stabilizer being considered for first treatments with other drugs or as a maintenance or in relapse situations? I know this is very early on. And so do you have a sense of what a timeline might be for having information like this?
Yeah, it's difficult to say at this point in the stage. Companies are usually completing preclinical studies, so studying the molecules in potentially animals, in cells. They're having these types of discussions with health authorities to understand what type of development plan they might need to look at, and they're asking a lot of these same questions. Are they best placed studying it in patients who have relapsed refractory and newly diagnosed, in combination with other treatments? And so unfortunately, we don't know yet. It's something that I hope we'll learn in the coming year, but it can be a lengthy process from initial test tube concept to actually building out that development program and understanding how to develop in patients who have the disease.
And I think we have time for just one more comment, one more question. And this is around, can you comment on novel therapies and how these compare and the role of bone marrow transplant or stem cell transplant, which is typically used in amyloidosis? Is that ever part of these studies? Is it something that rules you in or out? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about stem cell transplant much at all as part of this presentation, really focused on therapies, but it's obviously played a huge role in the treatment landscape and overall management of AL amyloidosis. Only a small percentage of patients who have AL amyloidosis are eligible for stem cell transplant. It's a great option for some. It's not an option for everyone. One of the trials I highlighted on that last slide, actually, the SWOG trial, Southwestern Oncology Group, is a study looking at, if I remember correctly, I've got to pull up the slide, but it was Daratumumab VCD plus stem cell transplant versus without stem cell transplant. So there are studies that are involved looking that incorporate stem cell transplant if that's something that patients are interested in. It is, so depending on what type of trial, again, all types of trials are looking at either newly diagnosed patients who are treatment naive, have never received any type of treatment, which would include stem cell transplant. There are trials that are looking for patients who are in relapse refractory stage, who have had some type of treatment previously. There might be limitations on what type of treatment it has, so it really depends on trials themselves.
And one very quick, I know we're at time, but I think important question is, there's somebody who's asked, is there anything being done for the rarer types of amyloidosis? And they had ALEC2 in mind. What are things that patients could do I know currently we don't have any trials. It's something we're very interested in at ARC, at seeing how we can support that. is there anything patients could do that would maybe help move the needle?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges in starting to try to build a movement in a rare disease, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. You need data in order to justify kind of moving forward and an understanding of what the disease is, how it progresses, how you might be able to develop a treatment. And so I think one of the biggest things patients can do is take part in whatever survey studies or qualitative studies are available. So our community survey is a great way and a great example, because what we want to try to do is get as much data as possible from as many patients to highlight what the disease looks like from a patient perspective, what kind of symptoms are involved, how it progresses over time. That's what really gives researchers a blueprint to then actually design studies to target molecules and treatments that might help them. If you're able to visit centers who have large-scale registries where they collect a lot of data regularly over time, centers like BU, like Mayo, those are also centers that I would really recommend if you've got a rare type of amyloidosis and have the means and the ability to travel to one of those centers, providing as much information and to those types of initiatives is really incredibly valuable. And that's really the first thing you can kind of do in terms of like getting the needle moving. I don't know if you have anything you would add, Isabel.
I would say, sign up to MAP as well. It is something we really are considering and working on. And so the more information we can have, the more that we have potentially that we can start advocating for. And it is an area that is really underserved. We really recognize that. And are really looking and considering how we might be able to get companies interested in looking to develop products for these rarer types with such huge unmet need. So I know we're just slightly over time. Kristen, this was fantastic. It is exciting to see that there is a lot going on. I know there's a lot also in the myeloma space that are drugs that have been developed and approved for multiple myeloma that are being investigated at academic centers, and you've touched on some of those. And so there is a lot of different options available if you want to participate in a clinical trial. Keep in touch with us. We're definitely update, and MAP is really kept up to date, and we'll keep you informed. This will be available as a resource on our website, and the slides will be available. I know Kristen went through, there were a lot of details that she covered today, and I think it's helpful to be able to pull those up and look at those. So thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. I would just, the two things as we close out, please consider doing the survey, which is which will come up at the end of this when you leave, that will provide us with any information that areas, that topics that you would like to cover, or areas that you think amyloid that ARC should focus on. And additionally, the work we do is funded by donors like you, and so please consider supporting the organization. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Kristen.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.